a lot of lawyers use different sort of entity types. The two most predominant ones are either, a Cayman Islands foundation. I think that's sort of the best one to create that bridge between on-chain governance and legal enforceability of on-chain actions. But, a Guernsey special purpose trust is still a good vehicle. And I think it's very replicable ecosystem to ecosystem. So, now very recently, we actually saw Lido using the Lido Alliance program and using, the Borg that was created by Gabriel Shapiro to create a sort of off-chain entity with on-chain mechanisms to sort of regulate.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Protocol Services Podcast. I'm your host, Jack Purdy, where we talk to leaders in the protocol services realm, everything from consultants, risk advisors, legal teams that are helping decentralized protocols advance. And today we have Joseph, the General Counsel of Axis Advisory. Welcome, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invite, Jack. Pleasure being here. Listened to some episodes actually before this one and pretty interesting. So excited to begin.
I love it. So I feel like the legal side of kind of what happens in crypto and a lot of more operational stuff, it happens a lot behind the scenes. Not many people are kind of privy to a lot of these challenges. So excited to see where this conversation goes. And I think maybe just as a starting point, would love to hear kind of how did Axis Advisory come to be?
Yeah, so that's actually a pretty interesting story. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. So by way of sort of preemption, Axis Advisors predominantly legal advisory sort of law firm based in Europe, very much focused on emerging technologies. We started off purely DeFi focused, and naturally that led to then our governance sort of work as well, which I'm sure we'll discuss at a later stage. But yeah, that's sort of a bit about how it came about is that straight out of uni, I was working at this crypto focused regulatory consulting firm. So was always sort of crypto focused, although I had some previous experience working in sort of litigation firms, more civil focused firms. Also had a sort of senior legal role at a public authority in Malta during my student years. And I had left that firm due to sort of a myriad of reasons. And I left without sort of a job in place. I just wanted a sort of fresh start, didn't know what I was going to do. So I was with that firm for close to 3 years, I think, 2.5, 3 years. But within those 3 years, I think I got double the experience because I used to work 14-hour, 12-hour days on a very much consistent basis to a certain extent. Willingly, I was not chained to a desk, willingly because I was infatuated with the industry, so to speak. And throughout sort of those months after I resigned, I was like, okay, but what the hell am I going to do? I have sort of bills to pay, let's put it that way. And I started getting some inquiries on the independent consulting side from a legal regulatory advisory perspective. At that point in time, I was already part of the YDX V4, the YDX chain operations team. So that was sort of a bit of a cushion, I would say, for myself, and also I would say opened up a lot of opportunities being associated with the YDX, being part of the initial team that set up the initial infrastructure for V4 as well. And yeah, there was a huge uptick in sort of inquiries on regulatory consulting, legal consulting, also governance, sort of advisory, and potential opportunities for governance contributions. And I was like, listen, I always thought about setting up a law firm, but when I'm 40, to be very honest with you, I'm there's no better time like the present. So I just went with it. First thing I did, I remember, was I was at a friend's place, creating the Axis Advisory website, the initial website. And I was like, okay, until you create a website, this isn't going to be a thing. So you need to put a face to the idea. And yeah, we basically kicked things off from there. Now it's been sort of almost a year of doing Axis Advisory, and it's been a roller coaster of positive emotions. And yeah, it's been a great ride thus far.
So I guess with some of those initial inquiries you were getting, and then what have now come to be kind of your first client base, is this mostly protocols, right? Where there's a token, where these are sort of decentralized communities?
Yeah, I'd say sort of for the initial inquiries, we started off mainly servicing I think 1 or 2 validator sort of clients. So actually one of them was a client of mine, which was at the previous firm. They saw that I started up a new venture. I'd like to think that I had serviced them well at the previous firm. They saw sort of this new venture and they were like, okay, we're going to move to use you as for service. And I think that was sort of my main client. So my very first client was this sort of validator service client called Simply Staking, based in Malta as well, where I'm based in. And that's where sort of we kick things off to a certain extent. But then the natural progression was sort of always, we're a bit restricted from a law firm perspective in Malta from a marketing and BD standpoint. So, as a law firm in Malta, you can't like put banners up that you're providing legal services and all this stuff. So that is where I was thinking, okay, so how can we get the name out there to start servicing more DeFi protocols, which is a sort of a passion of mine. I like the intricacies of decentralized finance, navigating different regulations and seeing the optimal jurisdictions for projects to operate in. And governance was sort of the answer to that. So like in Malta, we don't have the benefit of the US, where I remember being in the US a couple of months back. You're driving on a long road for hours and you see, a bunch of billboards with lawyers holding cash bags saying, personal injury, we'll get that money or something like that. So we can't do that on a Malta. So our go-to-market strategy was, okay, let's start participating in governance. And through that, we'll get sort of the Axis Advisory brand name out there and then get legal clients. And to a certain extent, it's worked really well. But yeah, from a service line perspective, we offer, the classic legal advisory in relation to commercial matters, so commercial law, corporate advisory, corporate structures. And then obviously on the regulatory side, regulatory risk assessments, which I think is pivotal for a lot of DeFi protocols nowadays, especially where you're based and where the founders are based and where you're offering the product from and all this stuff. And then regulatory authorizations as well, which I'm sure we'll discuss at a later stage. Now in the EU, we have the markets in crypto assets regulation. We're seeing an uptick in sort of centralized crypto asset service providers wanting to get authorized in the EU to then get the benefit of passporting their services to other EU member states as well. So that's a sort of high level overview of the services we currently offer, aside from our governance activities, which is more than a service. I see it as a sort of passion project. It is revenue generating, of course, but I think I use governance as a sort of excuse to take myself away from the legal work and just focus on something which is very interesting to me as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's also, a unique thing when you're servicing protocols where like you don't need to go do a ton of, top of the funnel marketing to get your name out there. Like you can just start contributing, right? You can just like put your name out there on the forum, start providing thoughts, and then, seeing where you can provide value. And then that can be like a natural foray into whatever you're doing. So I guess we'd love to hear about some of those early governance experiments and sort of how you put yourself out there to start contributing to some of these DAOs.
Yeah, so my very sort of first were Olympus DAO and Maker DAO, but there weren't any substantial contributions to those ecosystems. It was more sort of getting a lay of the land on how DAOs operate, sort of the governance process in general, sort of if I hold the token, what rights do I have on the token? And that sort of stemmed as well from the legal work. So a lot of the legal work that I used to do was sort of assessing tokens in light of applicable regulatory frameworks for projects that want to issue or offer that token to the public. And then that would lead me, okay, there are all these governance tokens, but what is this underlying governance framework that these token holders have a right in relation to, So I think the first prominent sort of area of contribution was DYDX, which then led me to DYDX operations. But yeah, they're definitely sort of, I would say, contributing my legal knowledge, so to speak, in relation to certain facets of the DYDX ecosystem. So I think DYDX was one of the first ecosystems out there to sort of launch this DAO initiative whereby you can launch certain legal entities. In that day and age, I'm referring, I think, over 1.5 years ago now, it was a Guernsey purpose trust where, via governance, you can launch a non-charitable special purpose trust in Guernsey. So that was very interesting to me because that was sort of the first evidence, so to speak, of this interplay between on-chain governance and, creating a bridge to a legal entity where that on-chain governance can have control over that legal entity with those actions actually being legally enforceable. So that is sort of where I started contributing and where sort of my area of interest initially stemmed from. And yeah, that sort of my contributions in DYDX then led me to getting elected in the DYDX operations team and still contributing to DYDX, still part of the operations team. And now we do quite a bit of work in Arbitrum, which I'm sure also we'll discuss throughout our podcast, which I would say I think the YDX put our name out there quite a bit, but I think our Arbitrum work is what really sort of moved the needle substantially and disproportionately when it came to sort of what Axis advisory is.
Yeah, so maybe with the DYDX work, is that something you think is like replicable for other DAOs, or do you see like most of these protocols sort of having to create these types of like Guernsey Trust legal entities to be able to like bridge the world between crypto and real world enforceable contracts?
Yeah, I think it's definitely replicable. A lot of lawyers use different sort of entity types. The two most predominant ones are either, the Cayman Islands Foundation. I think that's sort of the best one to create that bridge between on-chain governance and legal enforceability of on-chain actions. But, a Guernsey special purpose trust is still a good vehicle. And I think it's very replicable ecosystem to ecosystem. So, now very recently, we actually saw Lido using the Lido Alliance program and using, the Borg that was created by Gabriel Shapiro to create a sort of off-chain entity with on-chain mechanisms to sort of regulate and, create checks and balances for that on-chain entity. Similarly, we saw other ecosystems. I think MakerDAO was also using trusts for its RWA sort of exposure program as well. So yeah, I think it's definitely replicable. And very recently as well, we saw, Entropy Advisors proposing the launch of an operations company for Arbitrum. So I think there's more of recent uptick in this kind of work. And I think even with the recent, as I'm sure you saw, Lido DAO judgment in the US, not having a legal wrapper would potentially expose your contributors to some form of liability. I think this work will increase in the coming months and years for sure. I think what's needed is a bit of legal, regulatory, and corporate clarity on these vehicles, because right now it's sort of we're making it up as we go to the best of our knowledge. So I think once we have some legal precedents via adjudicated cases of these structures actually protecting contributors, is then when I see the needle moving substantially on this kind of work.
To talk a bit more about your work with Arbitrum. So maybe even from square one, like how did they first come on your radar as an interesting community DAO to start getting involved with?
Yeah, so this traces back actually to the YDX. At the time when I started contributing to the YDX, there was Clifton working at the YDX Foundation. A brilliant, in my opinion, DAO relations lead, currently working at the Arbitrum Foundation as well. He had left the YDX Foundation at the time and was doing some cool work in Arbitrum. I followed him on Twitter. I don't know if I should say Twitter or X at this point in time, so I'll say X or something so I don't get sort of berated. And I saw him doing like some cool stuff in Arbitrum, like especially I saw a huge sort of level of autonomy when it comes to governance contribution. So there didn't seem like there was any gatekeeping, and there isn't, in my personal opinion. And you can actually sort of as a contributor, like enter the forum, offer your thoughts. If there are any initiatives that you can contribute to, you're free to sort of spin them up, propose them, whatever it may be. So yeah, saw Clifton in Arbitrum, started following the Arbitrum forums, and sort of one of the first proposals that I actually came across was the Arbitrum Coalition proposal, which was initially proposed by, I think, Blockworks, Gauntlet, Trail of Bits, and L2Beat. And that was sort of the first, I would say, major proposal that I read through. Was very interesting. But the proposal didn't end up passing because I think there were some minor factors that the community didn't agree on, which, in my opinion, I understood that they could be sort of easily rectified. And I remember posting this tweet that, just because a governance proposal does not pass, does not mean that you shouldn't go back to the drawing board, get a more optimized, refined proposal out there, and submit it again. And at that point in time, actually, I had already started doing this, so I liked the idea so much that I actually, once I saw that it didn't pass, I'm like, there's that meme of, okay, I'll do it myself, I think by Thanos or something. And I started basically drafting it. And I remember Matt, actually, which now heads Entropy Advisors, reaching out to me. And I was like, you should start working on this proposal. I'm like, it's almost already done. But we already almost created the V2, so to speak, second draft of this proposal. And I think the main pay points there were sort of, first of all, the providers that were part of this collective meant to, spearhead research, development efforts, etc. within the Arbitrum ecosystem were chosen beforehand. So there wasn't an election process whatsoever for these providers. So that's sort of the first implementation that we made in that regard. And there was also a bunch of community concern on whether this is a centralizing force within the ecosystem, that there were a lack of checks and balances. So then that's where sort of our legal expertise came in to also in-bake certain legally enforceable checks and balances within that proposal. And that was sort of our first major proposal. It's called the Arbitrum Research and Development Collective, which now is in its second iteration, and we have the pleasure of having you guys apply for that as well. And yeah, that was basically it. The ARDC is basically composed of a research provider, a risk provider, a security provider, and a supervisor of sorts to oversee that the ARDC and the providers are acting in the best interests of the ecosystem. So that was sort of the first major one. And, in V1, we had Blockworks and Delphi elected, Chaos Labs, and also Open Zeppelin, with L2Beat acting as a supervisor, all done via election, duly sort of elected via an election process that we had set up as well. So that was sort of the first major initiative. And then through that, also, we started seeing a lot of different security providers coming to the Arbitrum DAO, so coming to the forums and actually wanting to offer security services, security research, DevRel efforts in relation to the Arbitrum tech stack, but in a piecemeal fashion. And this is when there was a DK, one of the sort of co-contributors of Premia Finance, that basically submitted a proposal to basically stop this and establish a procurement framework to procure these providers, have them readily available for the Arbitrum DAO, so that when a security need arises, we can tap into sort of this list of providers and basically solicit their services. And this is where we got our initial grant in Arbitrum, actually, from Plurality Labs to establish a procurement framework for the Arbitrum DAO. And now, sort of, we're still part of the Arbitrum DAO procurement committee. So that grant basically sort of catered for the creation of a procurement framework for security service providers, then also the creation of the Arbitrum DAO procurement committee, which is also now in its sort of second phase as well, together with the Arbitrum Research and Development Collective. And yeah, sort of those are our two major sort of initiatives within the ecosystems. Then we had a bit of a minor one, such as, donating 1 million ARP to Coin Center and DeFi Education Fund, which, this was in light of the Alexei and Roman sort of Tornado Cash Founder case. And we thought it best to sort of contribute to these two major policy institutions now within the industry. And they were helping out, and they still are helping out with Alexei and Roman's cases. And then we had, some other minor proposals throughout the year. Actually, I think we're now past, 9+ proposals passed, like 100% success rate for all our proposals, which is something, like a badge. One day a proposal will fail, and I'll be very distraught. We're on a high right now. We never had a proposal fail. But yeah, we'll see, I guess.
Something you guys work with as well. So Mika, I guess maybe for our listeners that haven't heard of that, maybe give us a brief sort of TLDR of what that means and implications for protocols.
I think sort of the EU basically came out with an EU harmonized framework for all its member states. So 20+ member states in the EU now have this sort of standard regulation when it comes to sort of regulating crypto assets. It's called the Markets in Crypto Assets sort of regulation. And it basically regulates crypto asset service providers, be it, your traditional, there are 3 classes under Mika, and to simplify them, I'll give you this example. So class 1 is your classic investment advisor. So a person telling you on what to invest in. Class 2 is sort of your classic investment broker / OTC desk. So using proprietary capital to, execute your trades or, forwarding those trades for execution. And then class 3 is basically your crypto.com, your OKX, your Binance. So like a full trading exchange. So those are sort of the main things that Mika regulates from a centralized service provider perspective. What it's done relatively well is also create a very good regime for stablecoins via electronic money tokens. So the EU has had a regulation, a directive actually, for electronic money. So, your Revolut, your Wise, all of these for the past, I think, almost 10 years. And they implemented a lot of those sort of different facets to stablecoins. And now we have a regulated sort of environment for stablecoin issuance and stablecoin offerings. And, we saw Circle getting a license in France for USDC and EURC, and it creates a sort of level playing field for providers in the European Union to be able to offer different services. I think although Mika is very good for centralized service providers, the EU has done a terrible job at giving clarity on DeFi, a very bad job actually. In fact, we only have one recital which makes reference to DeFi, kind of. It's recital 22, which said, that if you offer services in a fully decentralized manner without any intermediary in place, you do not need to basically get a Mika license. You are not regulated under this regime. So it's a gray area, because throwing fully decentralized out there when we don't have an industry-wide definition for it is a bit of I would say, has caused a bit of a shit show to a certain extent. But, the benefit is that the EU level regulators, being the European Securities Markets Authority, namely, has actually recognized that they've created a level of ambiguity with this and will be coming out potentially with, further sort of consultation papers and information documents on how one is to interpret what is a fully decentralized system at the technical level. I think, when it comes to decentralization, my Bible, and I like to call it my Bible, is Miles Jennings from A16 that had created and published, principles and models of Web3 decentralization, where he talks about, legal decentralization. So what amount of entities are contributing to a particular code base, then technical decentralization. So how decentralized is the project at the technical level? So, can Jack just use his admin key to take all the funds, switch off the entire smart contract or whatever? And the economic decentralization. So, how the method and manner of how you distribute tokens. So is it very easy to get a Humpy to basically, buy up a bunch of compound tokens and have a governance attack? So that would be economically a bit centralized and not decentralized. But I think, it's from a DeFi perspective, still a very much a gray area. But from a crypto asset centralized service provider perspective, I think we're seeing a huge uptick in sort of inquiries, at least from our end, for service providers, even US-based service providers, wanting to get an authorization in the EU. In our case, Malta, because Malta has had a crypto regulatory framework since 2017. We were one of the first jurisdictions in the world to basically have a framework to regulate this sort of new asset class or service class, so to speak. So yeah, my main frustration with Mika is that very good for centralized providers, gray area, huge gray area for DeFi. And, hopefully the US gets it right, though, betting sort of, or rather hoping and praying that the US gets it right. Because, for DeFi right now, I don't think there's any jurisdiction which has, offered sufficient, confident clarity on how to treat DeFi protocols.
Would you say that like Mika is going to like create more needs from protocol teams, be it like additional legal work or, other things, services in order to be compliant that kind of create like more like business opportunities in crypto, or maybe even something that teams should just have top of mind to make sure like, they will be able to participate in the European markets?
Yeah, I think there are definitely some interesting areas of sort of exploration there. I think, if ESMO offers sufficient clarity on what a fully decentralized without an intermediary system is, and, it gave the examples of AMMs, for example, very recently, earlier this year, I think we'll see a huge uptick in potentially, DeFi development activity and what I call true DeFi. Because in my opinion, if you develop a smart contract protocol and you're able to upgrade those smart contracts to take away funds either via initialization, proxy, admin keys, ownership control, whatever, I do not see that as DeFi. I think true DeFi is, rescinding any and all control and actually having a purely decentralized system, potentially governed by token holders, for example. But I think, we're seeing some interesting stuff when it comes to, even hybrid service providers. So, having a provider which has a sufficiently decentralized system, but has a facet of that system which potentially needs licensing. So that is where, we have this sort of hybrid service providers where, potentially you have a custody element, but you have an on-chain fully decentralized element. So you wouldn't need a license for the on-chain fully decentralized element, but you'd need a license for the custody element, for example. From our side, it's naturally led to increase in workload on the regulatory risk assessment side, because, for an EU-based founder, and Mika is very strict on regulatory arbitrage, so, using offshore companies to offer products, but you're based in the EU, sort of where is that product being offered from? Because if you don't have a lot of substance in that offshore jurisdiction, it could lead to the local regulator in the EU basically telling you, you're not kidding anyone, you're offering this product, you have control over that offshore entity. So it's definitely increased the workload on our side on regulatory risk assessment and regulatory risk identification. But I think sort of from a DeFi perspective, sort of the main sort of workload will experience an uptick when we get sufficient clarity on sort of what a fully decentralized system is. And, regulators are not sort of, I would say, blindsided to the fact that we have a lot of governance and decentralization theatrics. In fact, ESMA called it decentralization illusion as well. So, you have the EU regulator basically being aware that you're not kidding anyone if you just have a snapshot governance framework to have a DAO having control over a treasury, for example. But it's definitely giving rise to more, I would say, regulatory nuances you have to take into account when structuring sort of some of these products from a legal backend point of view, for sure.
Protocol teams kind of progress along the decentralized path on all those different facets. The legal needs only get more complex. So definitely if your team out there, make sure you get good legal advice from experts like we got here. But I guess, yeah, for maybe one last question, like, what are you most excited about kind of for the next 12 months when it comes to, the state of crypto, any legal changes, DAO governance evolvements, anything like that?
Yeah, so I think from a sort of legal regulatory perspective, I'm mostly excited about this. The EU came out with a DLT market infrastructures regulation. So, it's proposing the creation of, I would say, a streamlined regulatory framework for tokenized RWAs. So actually tokenizing financial instruments, it being fully regulated, and you being able to utilize those RWAs in, I would say, a legally and regulatory compliant manner. So I think, they're testing this out with some different multilateral trading facilities, which are basically like trading firms, exchanges, whatever it may be in traditional finance. But yeah, I think that's definitely interesting because having an EU regulator actually see the benefit of blockchain sort of technical nuances and technical infrastructure to even alleviate some of the costs related to, financial instrument transfer services, administration when it comes to these different financial instruments, be it, central securities depositories or whatever it may be. I think it's definitely an interesting sort of dynamic. And I think RWA protocols in the industry have experienced a huge uptick in development, but most of them are operated via black box entities. So, you buy a tokenized RWA, but it's an offshore BVI entity that you do not know whether it has actually the real world off-chain asset in its holding. Mm-hmm. So you're buying a token that, is pegged to Apple stock, but do they actually have the Apple stock like in their custody? You don't know. And I think, Switzerland actually was spearheaded this, where they had, ledger-based securities. So they've had this for ages, but seeing that in the EU is definitely something that's welcome from my end. And I'm excited to see that sort of come to fruition. I think, though, from a crypto perspective, what I'm mostly excited about, if I'm being very honest, is obviously Berachain. We have a bunch of Berachain clients, so I'm interested to see sort of proof of liquidity in action. Actually wearing a Berachain hat now, so shameless plug for the Berachain ecosystem there. But I'm actually very interested in seeing sort of proof of liquidity in action and how that potentially sets a standard of how, the incentive layer at the L1 sort of layer are structured in the future. Because I think the status quo at this point in time is that there's a huge gap between the sort of L1 and the application layer from an incentives perspective. And I think what Berachain does really well there is sort of streamline and borderline eliminate that gap to a certain extent, where, the application layer and the sort of L1 are to a certain extent intertwined from a liquidity perspective, from a yield perspective, and from a bunch of other sort of different areas and points of view. So that's definitely sort of one that I'm looking forward to, because I think Berachain, obviously memes aside and all the culture aside, which has led to, a budding sort of builder ecosystem, it's actually very interesting technology. So I'm hoping to see potentially other chains implement this sort of novel mechanic when it comes to proof of liquidity to align incentives, I think, between different stakeholders, be it validators, be it development teams, application layer teams, or whatever it may be. So I think that's potentially the project that I'm mostly excited about. And hopefully they say it's launching in Q5 this year. Obviously, that's another meme, but we'll see. Hopefully, it launches by end of year, and we'll see some cool stuff on Berachain.
I love it. Well, awesome. This was a great conversation, Joseph. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks a lot, Jack. It was a pleasure. Hope to see you guys, potentially elected to the ARDC, and potentially us having, further communications down the line. And thanks a lot. You're doing very good work with these podcasts. I've listened to them all. Obviously, I have to listen to them to get a sort of inkling on how these go in my preparation, but they're very interesting. So keep them up. And yeah, great work. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much.